Prologue. Bauer's Perspective. The White House was a place for grand gestures, but I had no use for them. The halls, the columns, the flags, they were symbols of power, certainly, but they didn't affect the work. For a man in my position, it was all just background noise. Power wasn't in the architecture. It was in the quiet decisions made behind closed doors. Decisions that no one would ever speak of, not in public. I moved down the corridor, my steps even, unhurried. I never rushed. There was no need to. In this town, time was your ally if you knew how to use it. My briefcase hung in my left hand, filled with reports and intelligence summaries about a country most Americans couldn't point to on a map, Yugoslavia. But to me, it wasn't just another communist state. It was a potential key to something much larger. The aide waiting for me outside the Oval Office was nervous. They always were, the young ones. Fresh faces straight out of Harvard or Georgetown, still under the illusion that they were part of some great national calling. He glanced at me, then at the door, his shoulders stiff. "Right this way, Mr. Bauer!" I gave a small nod and stepped past him, keeping my expression neutral. I'd been here before, plenty of times. I knew what to expect. The heavy doors of the Oval Office opened with a quiet click, and I stepped inside. The room was exactly as I remembered it. Formal, orderly, with just a hint of the tension that seemed to hang in the air whenever Nixon was in one of his moods. Nixon stood behind his desk, as he often did, staring at a map of Europe that had been pinned to the wall. His back was to me. I didn't announce my presence. That wasn't how this worked. I waited in silence, letting the moment build as Nixon continued tracing the borders of Eastern Europe with his finger. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if he could change the course of nations by simply redrawing the lines in his mind.
Bauer,
Nixon said without turning, his voice low but clear.
sit down.
I moved to the chair across from his desk, setting my briefcase beside me but keeping my hands loosely folded in my lap. I knew better than to dive into the briefing. Nixon liked to lead. He liked to test the waters before you gave him what he wanted.
Tito,
Nixon muttered, finally turning to face me. His eyes were cold, sharp.
what are we dealing with?
I allowed myself a brief pause, just long enough to show I was weighing my words. Mr. President, Tito's walking a fine line between the East and the West. He's independent, too independent for Moscow's liking, but he's also not fully aligned with us. He's playing both sides. Nixon's lips pressed into a thin line. He hated ambiguity, but ambiguity was what this job often dealt in. He sat down behind the desk, leaning forward, his eyes never leaving mine.
Independent communism.
He said softly, as though the phrase left a bitter taste in his mouth.
He's making a mockery of the Soviets. Stalin couldn't rein him in, and Brezhnev's not having much luck either.
That's right, I said quietly, not interrupting the rhythm of his thoughts. Moscow's grip on Eastern Europe is weakening. Tito's refusal to fall in line is showing other satellite states that there might be a way to be communist without following Moscow's orders. If Tito succeeds, we could see a shift in the balance of power, not in the way anyone predicted. Nixon nodded slightly, still focused. He was a calculating man, always trying to look 3 steps ahead, though sometimes he overestimated how far he could see.
And what's he doing with our aid?
He's using it, certainly, I said, but not in the ways we might have hoped. He's channeling much of it into his scientific research. Biology, particularly. Unconventional fields. We're picking up reports out of Belgrade that his scientists are working on something significant, something that could give Yugoslavia a military edge.
What kind of edge?
Nixon asked, his eyes narrowing. We don't have specifics yet, I replied smoothly, my tone measured. but there are early indications of advanced biological research, biotechnology, possibly cloning. I said the last word carefully, watching for Nixon's reaction. His brow furrowed slightly, but he didn't seem surprised. Nixon had heard rumors before, just as I had.
In Moscow?
Nixon asked. They're in the dark, I said. The Soviets have no idea how far along these projects are. Tito's keeping them out, just as much as he's keeping us at arm's length. He's using his independence as leverage, and it's working. Nixon stared at the map on his desk for a long moment, his fingers tapping lightly on the wood. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on me.
Bauer, this isn't just about Yugoslavia anymore. If Tito pulls this off, if he makes communism work without Moscow, we could see a domino effect. The whole of Eastern Europe could start looking to him for leadership.
He paused, his eyes narrowing.
You know what happened to Jack?
It wasn't a question. It wasn't even an accusation. It was just a reminder. Nixon knew that I understood how the world worked, how men who thought they could operate outside the lines usually ended up on the wrong side of history, or in Jack's case, the wrong side of a bullet. Yes, sir, I said calmly. My voice didn't waver. It never did.
We need loyalty now more than ever.
Nixon continued, his tone darker.
You've been around long enough to know that. I'm counting on you for this, Bauer. I need men who understand what needs to be done when the time comes.
I nodded, not breaking eye contact. You can count on me, Mr. President, as always. Nixon leaned forward slightly.
So what's your plan?
I allowed myself a small exhale, just enough to show I'd been preparing for this. I spoke with calm precision, never rushing. Tito needs resources, money, equipment, and expertise. He needs to keep Yugoslavia stable without relying on Moscow or the West. That makes him vulnerable. We can offer him what he needs, but with strings attached. Nixon raised an eyebrow. Go on. We give him just enough to keep his projects going, but we ensure that we control the direction of those projects. Tito's desperate to keep his independence, and that gives us leverage. We get access to his research, quietly. We guide it, and we make sure it serves our interests.
What kind of research are we talking about?
Nixon asked, leaning in further, his voice lowering. Biotechnology, cloning, I said, letting the word linger. Imagine a military force where soldiers can be cloned, replicated when necessary. A self-sustaining army. That's what his scientists are working toward, though they may not fully understand the implications yet. Nixon didn't flinch, but I could see the gears turning in his mind.
And Tito?
Future, I said calmly. He'll believe he's gaining an edge over both the Soviets and the West. But in reality, we'll be the ones in control. We'll have oversight, and we'll direct the outcomes. Silence filled the room as Nixon considered the proposal. I didn't rush him. Collected, calm, and waiting, I knew my value lay in providing Nixon with the options he needed, not the explanations he might want. Finally, Nixon gave a slow nod, a thin smile forming on his lips.
Good. I like it. Quiet, controlled, with deniability. But Bauer, if this goes wrong, it's on you.
I gave a brief nod. Understood, Mr. President.
And Bauer?
Nixon added, his voice growing colder.
Remember what I said about loyalty.
I understand, I replied, my tone even. As I stood and gathered my briefcase, I could feel the weight of what had just been set in motion. Nixon was on board, and now it was up to me to make it happen. Tito wouldn't know what hit him, and Yugoslavia, well, it would become something far more valuable than just another communist state. As I left the Oval Office, I glanced back at Nixon, who had already returned to studying the map of Europe. The pieces were falling into place. And while the president believed he was pulling the strings, I knew the truth. Yugoslavia was about to become my playground for a new era of warfare. One built not just on politics, but on biology itself. And Tito? He'd just become the perfect unwitting partner in something far bigger than he could ever imagine.